Thanks for joining us. They'll give one more minute for people to filter in. I see names still popping up in our participants. We'll just welcome everyone to our inaugural Research in Action lecture series which is a series we hope to continue in the coming academic years on especially early career researchers working in that affect our modern world today. And I think our first speaker really embodies that connection between the ancient and modern. So I am very happy to welcome Katie Paul. Katie is the director of the Tech Transparency Project, where she specializes in tracking extremism, disinformation, and criminal activity on online platforms such as Facebook. She also serves as co-director and co-founder of the Antiquities, Trafficking, and Heritage Anthropology Research Project, and a founding member of the Alliance to Counter Crime Online. She holds a bachelor's degree from Miami University with a double major in anthropology and ancient Greek, and she earned her an MA in anthropology at the George Washington University. So I will turn it over to Katie Paul. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks so much for having me, Vanessa. I'm really excited to be part of this new lecture series. I think it's more important now than ever. So I'm sharing my screen with everybody. Okay, so one of the things that I've focused on for the past 5 years or so is the Black market in antiquities on Facebook, and particularly the way that the platforms, their algorithms, and their general business model help promote this kind of activity, despite it being illegal and in some cases a war crime. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the ATHAR project, ATHAR is actually the Arabic word for antiquities. And the Antiquities, Trafficking, and Heritage Anthropology Research Project is really a volunteer project by myself, my colleague Amr Al-Azam, and another colleague of ours. And this is just a project that we do in our spare time. We both have full-time jobs, but we have a very unique area of expertise that lends to this important issue, particularly the cross-section of tech and trafficking. And we're partnered with some great organizations that work on these issues, including the Alliance to Counter Crime Online, who look at a broad range of trafficking on the platform, everything from drugs to wildlife to human trafficking and human remains. What we do is essentially what we call guerrilla research. It's all open source investigative research. We're not using any special scrapers. We're not operating on the platform any differently than a user looking to engage in this activity would. It's all non-participant observation. The most engagement that we have is to answer what are usually simple yes and no questions to join a private group. And from there, we simply monitor and record because we don't want to influence the behavior that we're seeing in any way. All of this data is collected manually to ensure the accuracy of the context that the content is recorded. And as you'll see, just like with archaeology, the importance of having something in situ to ensure that its context is appropriate, the same thing applies when it comes to gathering digital data. We want to not just have an image of the artifact or the location, but the context in which that artifact was shared, the date, the group, whether it was a looting or trafficking group. All of this is important contextual evidence that we try to preserve as we record this data. We've been doing this since about 2018, and we are currently monitoring, although this number is higher now, it's now over 375 Facebook groups, about just as many Facebook pages, all dedicated to looting and trafficking. We've recorded over 9,000 posts engaging in this activity. These groups collectively have over 12 million group members across the globe, everywhere from the Middle East to the US to Thailand to Ukraine. And we've captured over 12,000 images. And while that sounds like a low number, given the scale of things that are on Facebook, this is what we're able to capture in our free time, furiously screenshotting away on Facebook. Now, a lot of the content we focused on has focused around the Middle East because of our areas of expertise, but we will see these same patterns emerge in other areas, as I'll show you. But primarily what we're seeing is a lot of trafficking from conflict zones like Libya, these statue heads from the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Cyrene. We see Palmyrene artifacts and busts being trafficked from places like Syria, cuneiform bowls from, not cuneiform tablets and in bowls from Iraq. And then we also see bronzes from Yemen, as well as artifacts from a slew of other countries. Now, these platforms are important because they serve as a digital trafficking toolkit. When we first started looking into this issue, you have to think about the timeline. I started looking at Facebook and Antiquities generally in 2011 following the Arab Spring. There was an explosion of growth in terms of the number of users in the region that were engaging on Facebook. And while looking at what was initially activist research to record looted and trafficked sites across countries like Egypt, I stumbled upon these groups that were explicitly trafficking artifacts. And I mean explicitly as in groups named pharaonic artifacts for sale. Here you see a video of a user in Libya. This video was actually taken just 2 days ago. He is listed as a group expert by Facebook, and you can see him using heavy machinery to loot a site. The video is about 40 minutes long. It was live streamed, which is just one of the features that's really valuable on Facebook in particular for many of these traffickers, because you're not just dealing with looting, they will actually live stream from the field and get input from other users as they're at a site engaging. Users who have more experience may tell them where to dig, what to use, what types of tools, and what they may find. And so this has become an increasingly useful tool, particularly as mobile connectivity increases across the region. We see live streams like this from the field happening more and more often. But other valuable pieces of the digital trafficking toolkit that Facebook provides include impact platform payments, algorithmically suggested content, in this case, other looting and trafficking groups, the marketplace platform, which makes it very easy to list material to buy and sell, and then of course, encrypted messaging, which is where we lose the trail of the artifact. And in many cases, this is where the private final deal is taking place. So from an ethnographic perspective, there are a few observations we've made in doing this research before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what we find in terms of what's being trafficked. First, it's important to remember that as a digital trafficking toolkit, Facebook has really lowered the bar of entry for the illicit trade. 10, 20 years ago, if an individual found artifacts, perhaps in their backyard, or if they were looting, trying to find something to sell, they'd need a network to sell that material into. This is, of course, these networks have existed for many centuries. There are trafficking networks across the region, but to find somebody that's in those networks and get that material out of your hands was always difficult. It required person-to-person connections and interaction. But with Facebook, you're able to maximize the potential buyers by the thousands. And that's what we saw with this user in Derna, Libya. Here we see that the same statue, Greco-Roman statue, has been posted in multiple Facebook groups, each of them varying from 5,000 members to 18,000 members. And he offers these items explicitly for sale, says that they're in Libya, but what previously would have been required a person-to-person interaction to get these items out of his hands, he's now able at the click of a button to access an international pool of potential buyers and traffickers that could take those items off of his hands. And unfortunately, we're seeing the same thing now happening with Ukraine on the international scale. These two images that were taken over the past 2 weeks are both from the same Facebook group, which we have written about many times on our Twitter account, yet Facebook refuses to take it down. It's a group called Artifacts for Sale. It's based in the US, and in the past 2 weeks, we've seen users explicitly stating that artifacts from Ukraine are available for sale. They're shipping them from Ukraine. Here on the right, you see the user explicitly says, found metal detecting in Ukraine. They're really not mincing words, and this provides a direct interaction for international trafficking that would have required many more steps prior to the advent of social media in many of these countries. And it's not just trafficking that these users are interested in. We also see financing of antiquities looting. Now, this has become of interest lately because of a case that I'll touch on in a bit. But here we have a user. On the left are some of the images. You see what appear to be human remains, small artifacts. that he's found while looting. And this is basically indicating, yeah, I have good stuff. This is a tomb. And the type of tomb that you're seeing here, this was a user in Egypt. It's quite deep. It's a stone cut excavation. And you can tell, although you can't hear because of the sound is turned off, but there's really heavy machinery involved in this. This is not something a lay person could do and requires a lot of financing to get off the ground. And we do see that being sold in these types of Facebook groups. There are actually in Egypt Facebook groups dedicated just to providing services to help people loot artifacts from tombs that are filled with groundwater. Sometimes it's either difficult to pump the groundwater out, or it is so deep that it requires a diver. And what we see here is a user who is the admin of the group providing these diving services to dive into tombs that have been logged with water in Egypt in order to pull out the artifacts. They'll often do this for a cut of whatever the final sale price is from the individual who owns the property. And they often have the expensive equipment required to do this. So this is the perfect marriage of services and crime that can be engaged on Facebook. Here's another example from Egypt. A looter here, this was in June of last year, posted a video of pharaonic reliefs that he had access to. These were likely near his property or under his home. But in order to finish excavating the site, and particularly to remove these reliefs, he needs financing because it requires heavy tools. And so hopping on one of these Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members dedicated to this activity helps generate that kind of financing. And this is a scheme that people actually engage in. Some of you may have heard the case last year of a former member of parliament in Egypt, a multimillionaire, and several members of a gang that had been arrested for trafficking antiquities. It came out that the millionaire financing this activity, he wasn't actually digging, but he was part of a network of wealthy individuals that were financing the illicit antiquities being excavated by this gang. And just yesterday, the businessman was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his financing of these archaeological excavations. The former member of parliament and 5 of the leaders of the gang were each sentenced to 10 years in prison. And then 17 other members of the gang were sentenced to 5 years apiece. These are incredibly harsh sentences in terms of the types of sentences we've seen handed down for antiquities looting and trafficking in Egypt before. So this was clearly meant to send a message. But the fact that this kind of gang is prominent enough that it can span multiple countries to finance this shows just how effective these financing schemes are. And we see very well-financed traffickers in countries like Egypt who are quite experienced, and they're able to connect with international buyers on Facebook. This is an example that we recorded back in April 2019. This particular Facebook profile was created the day that this post went up. It was a fake profile, obviously. The individual was very bent on protecting their identity. As you see here, that's highlighted in red, a user that was actually an antiquities dealer based in New York replied that they were interested in purchasing the items. And shortly after that exchange took place, the entire profile was removed, but we had captured all of the data, including the images that the user shared of the cartonnage he had found. And this is a particularly experienced trafficker because we see not only a Black background trying to display this like we see in higher end galleries, but the fact that he actually showed the unpainted underside of the cartonnage is something that we don't see with lower level traffickers. And he's clearly marketing to a very specific and knowledgeable type of interested buyer. This is not the lay person who is looking for a network to traffic these items to. The scale of the items also suggests that this individual is already part of a network that has ease with moving things out of the country. Here are the background that I mentioned. And we see this kind of activity in Syria as well. Here are 2 examples. These were recorded about a year and a half apart. On the left is a video that was posted by a user from Syria who in Raqqa, Syria, who had these mosaics available. You can see they're still in ground, in situ. Clearly, it's a rudimentary excavation that is not the type of typical excavation. And here, about a year and a half later, again, a user from Raqqa, he's now offering these removed mosaics in Syria on the right. And we were able to identify that these are the same mosaics because they had very unique faces. When mosaics are removed from the ground, you get the inverse side of the imagery, and we were able to identify this image of the female in the mosaic on the left that was still in situ. Now in November 2020, we see her on the right removed and available for sale in Turkey. So following these kind of traffickers on social media also provides the opportunity to follow the patterns of artifact movement in some cases, particularly in conflict zones. For lower level traffickers, we see a lot of metal detecting as a common activity. Metal detectors are quite popular, and this is a trend that is not specific to the Middle East. We see it across the globe. I always share the dancing metal detectors video because, of course, Facebook is a paradise for looters and metal detectorists. But we see the same type of activity in Thailand. Here, users metal detecting and sharing pictures of artifacts from the field. And just as recently as last month, metal detectorists in Ukraine during the conflict, using this as an opportunity to go out while they're searching for landmines and also loot material. And along with metal detecting, smaller portable artifacts are often very popular. Not only are they often in higher quantity, they're easier to move, and selling a lot of these items at a low value can still generate a lot of funding for criminal elements. And I think that that's important to remember. When we look at things like oil lamps or coins, we'll even see looters mix together real and fake artifacts to try to bolster the size of the lot and ultimately the value of what they're selling. We also see looters are able to control the market quality of what's happening in these groups, really by naming and shaming. This is an example from, I believe, last year. A user was seeking input from fellow group members regarding the value of a jar that he had come across. He's clearly not an experienced trafficker, and he's very quickly mocked by the other users. You see here where there's the reactions on Facebook. The laughing face is actually one of the most popular reactions because he's being made fun of. This is in the largest Facebook group that we're currently monitoring, which at the time had 452,000 members. I think it's closer to a full 500,000 members now. And this is one of hundreds of Facebook groups that we monitor. But in the first comment on his post, you can see a user starts making fun of him, saying that it's an estimated 3 years old. And other users continued to mock him. Well, one came in and said, look, don't mock. This is somebody who's asking to learn. Other users quickly came in with more mocking. One who said that the group member artifact was made 9/9/2020, which was the date that this artifact was actually posted. Ultimately, the user ended up deleting the post, but this had the desired effect, which was to ensure that the fake stuff or scammers are removed from the platform. And people are so frequently mocked for posting illegal or for posting fake material that it's actually reached meme status in some cases. And you see here what is very clearly, it can't even be considered a good souvenir. This cross-eyed gold painted material that you see, users post the piece is original, it just came out of the ground. Again, mocking what we see from other traffickers who do attempt to post fake material and offer it as real. I did want to make sure to highlight Ukraine in this discussion, given that it's front of mind for many people. We've been following what's happening in Ukraine, and from an ethnographic standpoint, it's given us a really interesting window into how the conflict has evolved in these Ukrainian Facebook groups for looting and trafficking antiquities. I think it's really important to note that unlike the groups in the Middle East, many of these Facebook groups are for hobbyists as opposed to people that do this as a means of subsistence. And so these Facebook groups for Ukraine have actually been around for many years. Dr. Sam Hardy has been following the issue of Ukrainian metal detecting for some time, and I highly recommend you look at his work. But these groups have remained active through the conflict, and we've been able to see how the mindset of these looters has changed as the conflict's dragged on. At the early part of the conflict, we're talking about early March, late February, there was still a lot of patriotism. You saw people encouraging patches that would have war slogans on them. This isn't uncommon. There was a lot of support among these group members. But as the conflict went on, we saw more things. Here's an example of looting and metal detecting being associated with patriotism. He's painted his metal detector in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. But as time went on, obviously, there were bigger issues at play. Here we saw a member of the territorial defense actually in a Facebook group for metal detecting, asking people to donate their metal detectors to the front so that they could be used to help with the detection of landmines. And shortly after that post, his wish was granted. Metal detectors were donated to the front from the group. You can see them here posing with it. With the territorial defense. Now, one popular group, the users started pointing out the realities that they're now facing. The community of metal detectors that were once finding artifacts, a user notes that used to be a joke. They would always find people's things in the ground, but now they're the ones who have to bury their assets in the ground to protect them from Russian troops and from others. This was posted on March 13th. And we saw the grim reality of the conflict continue to evolve, but still working in that hobby that many used in some cases as a mental escape route. Here, a user that was now a soldier on the front shared two photos of themselves digging graves for others and noted, "I used to dig them up, now I dig them." An admission that he used to be engaged in digging up graves, but now these users were engaged in digging graves for their own people. And you saw other users in these Facebook groups take issue with the fact that people were selling these artifacts. I think it's important to remember that very different parts of Ukraine are having majorly different experiences on this. And so while some people were under siege and had lost their livelihoods, others in places like Kyiv weren't experiencing that level of conflict and would criticize people who offered artifacts for sale. Here you see an individual offering some arrowheads for sale, and he is criticized that this is not the time to try to offer artifacts for sale because of the conflict. And people weigh in and say, but what if a person has nothing to eat? What are they supposed to do? There's nothing available. And that's a theme that we continue to see, to the point where one of the group admins actually posted in the group that to shame these people who are offering items for sale is wrong because so many people have lost their salaries. And I'm not going to read all of these, but there were a lot of comments in support of the fact that people need to be able to sell whatever they can to sustain themselves during conflict. So we see this group that had once become hobbyists now moving to becoming subsistence looters, like we see in so many of the other conflicts. And we see that conflict is a major catalyst for trafficking. In our 2019 case study on Syria, we looked at 4 Facebook groups, recorded them in their entirety, and found that the majority of artifacts were being offered from nations either in conflict or bordering conflict. And I think that that's important to remember. We also see that a lot of the material posted mirrors material on the market. And in many cases, as you saw from Syria, these are items that are posted while they're still in the ground. And when they're still in situ, that means there's likely no previous evidence that that item ever existed to ensure that it could be repatriated. And in conflict zones, of course, under the 1952 Hague Convention, 1954 Hague Convention, this is considered a war crime. And this is critical evidence. So the most important piece of the work of the ATHAR project is preserving this digital record of valuable evidence, because it's been used in war crimes before. In the 2016 ICC trial of Ahmed Fathi al-Mahdi, he was actually convicted because YouTube video that was posted of this militant himself destroying the tombs in Timbuktu was used to convict him of these war crimes at his trial. We've seen in other war crimes cases at the ICC, a Libyan national commander, this relied on Facebook video that was being posted by Libyan militants directly to Facebook. And this video was actually preserved by Bellingcat. Facebook had been erasing the evidence if it violated its policies without taking into the fact that this was often very critical war crimes evidence. And we see in conflict zones, artifacts are offered all the time, and they often mirror a lot of the valuable material on the market. Here are some examples of material that we see from Afghanistan, some of it offered from Pakistan, artifacts like Gandhar and Buddha. We also see Bactrian artifacts offered frequently on Facebook. In Iraq, of course, incantation bowls and cuneiform artifacts. And these are something that have been popular on the market since the Gulf War. We, of course, see Greco-Roman material offered from Libya. In fact, the US just recently returned a Greco-Roman head to Libya that was seized by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Myanmar as well, we see Buddhist artifacts offered, and some users are explicitly noting that these were excavated in the area of Burma or found in Myanmar. In some cases, the fact that these items are from conflict zones is the selling point. Of course, in Syria, mosaics and Palmyrene busts are popular. And in Ukraine, because of the large metal detecting culture and the fact that people are now using metal detectors in the field to look for landmines, many different types of metal artifacts are what we're seeing. These are just a few that have been posted in the past month. And from Yemen, as I mentioned previously, bronze statue heads, alabaster, and other small artifacts that are portable like coins are also frequently offered. And because we see this material coming from conflict zones, we also see militants marketing artifacts as well. This is a video that was posted this past December from a user listed in Gaza City. He's also a supporter of the Al-Qassam Brigades, which are a faction of Hamas, a US designated terrorist group. And in the video, you can see that he is sharing an in situ mosaic, not unlike the activity we saw in Syria. This is essentially a mosaic that is in the process of being looted, and he is posting it and offering it on the platform. A Taliban supporter based in Pakistan expressed interest in purchasing a Gandharan style Buddha from a user in September 2020, which was just a month after the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban. Now, the reason that the interest in purchasing this item as opposed to looting it is important is because when we look at the history of the Taliban, and particularly the Taliban's strengths as a criminal entity in Afghanistan, it's not so much the actual looting activity, but their longstanding trafficking networks, particularly those around opioids, that are really valuable. And so we're likely to see a lot of Taliban interested in purchasing and moving these artifacts through these kind of platforms, as opposed to actually engaging. We're able to see his support by going through this user's likes and follows on Facebook, and we can clearly see that he's a supporter of multiple elements of the Pakistani Taliban. In areas like Syria and Turkey, we see users actually offer artifacts for sale. This was a post from 2018 that's specifically asking for old books or manuscripts available in Jordan. And users will post real and fake material that they have in their possession in the replies as offers of what's available, as you see this user posted here. And when we go to he posts at the bottom, Fi Syria, it's available in Syria. And when we go to his profile, we quickly see that he is a supporter of the neo-fascist Turkish Grey Wolves. He posts their propaganda. It was the top thing posted on his page. And it's another example of how some of these extremist groups are engaged in trafficking. Here we see a cuneiform tablet offered from a user in Karbala, Iraq, who on their Facebook page and through multiple likes expressed support for Shia militia and the Shia cleric and militia leader Muqtada al-Sadr. And of course, ISIS as the most famous, we try not to start with them because of the fame. There are so many other extremist and militant groups that engage in this activity. It's important not to tie everything to ISIS, but of course, ISIS supporters are also engaged in trafficking antiquities on Facebook. Here you see a lot of coins that are available. These are items that often don't need to carry a provenance to be traded and can easily be thrown up on e-commerce platforms like eBay in order to offer them for sale as well. Another conflict militant, here we have one from Libya who was an elite part of the elite military unit of Gaddafi loyalists that were commanded by his son. He's offering artifacts for sale in a Facebook group. He makes pretty clear that he's a militant through the poses in his Facebook profile and cover photo. In Yemen, of course, the Southern Liberation Front, another faction that's fighting in the area of Aden, which is under Houthi control, was posting gold coins for sale. Again, he lists as his job that he's a member of the Southern Liberation Front. And ensuring that we look further into the profiles and not just the post is one of the important pieces of kind of following these digital trails to understand more about the context of this content. This is a post that was gathered in October last year, so long before, months before the conflict with Russia, but this was one of the Ukrainian Facebook antiquities trafficking groups we were following. And you can see here, although the camouflage makes it difficult, this user actually has his metal detector in one hand and his rifle in the other. And it's very clear when we go to his profile that he was a supporter of the Right Sector, which is a far-right paramilitary group in Ukraine. This is just an example of the fact that the militant and extremist trafficking is not just confined to the Middle East. We see it across the globe, including places like Ukraine. We also see users that actually kind of post trails when they're about to have something for sale. This is a user that on January 4th, 2021, who was listed in Damascus, Syria, posted an artifact he said that he had found in a grave. When we look at the other posts this user had included in this particular Facebook group, we see a post from just 3 days earlier where he has his small pick at the foot of his of where he's excavating, making clear that he was excavating a site. Now, these types of posts, while it doesn't seem to serve any sort of sale interest, he knew he would likely come across material, and this gives them the ability to prove that the material that they're offering for sale is real. Again, that market quality aspect that some users get kind of shamed for offering fake artifacts. Others that are offering small pieces want to be able to show that the material they have is real. And so they will often post the sites that they're digging at as kind of a digital trail, bread trail, to show that they're going to have those real artifacts available. When we go through this user's profile likes, we can see that not only is he a frequent trafficker and engaged in multiple trafficking pages, like these coin trafficking pages, but we also see that he is a major supporter of Syria's President Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian military, who have themselves engaged in quite a few war crimes. So before we go to the last part, I just want to highlight some frequently asked questions that we get. One of them is, wow, there's a lot of trafficking on Facebook. Have you shared this with or spoken to Facebook? Yes, we have spoken to Facebook. After our 2019 report came out, several months later, after quite a bit of media attention, Facebook reached out to us and informed us that they would like to create a policy that addressed the antiquities trade. Great, huge step, happy to hear it. That policy was put in place in June 2020, but unfortunately, Facebook informed us they would be erasing, not archiving, any of the material that was found under the policy, and therefore they would be erasing a lot of war crimes evidence, which was against our advice. And additionally, after testing the policy several times, we found really it was just a public relations stunt. There's been very little effect of any of the policy. And in fact, the last dozen or so posts that we've reported trying to get any read on the policy, they are no longer even checking them. They get sent into the Facebook universe, we get no response, and they are never heard from again. So yes, we've spoken to Facebook, but like many of their issues, they're not heavily engaged in addressing this. If a company like Facebook removes these groups, that won't solve looting. Of course not. Won't the traffickers just move to another platform? This is a great question. Of course, there are lots of platforms that are encrypted messaging like Signal and Telegram, but what makes Facebook unique are several things. One, the lowered bar to entry. A lot of people have grandparents that are able to get on and access Facebook. They understand how to use it. There's a certain ease of usability for them. And sometimes we don't have that same level of digital literacy with the other platforms. There's also the issue just of general reach. On Facebook, you can search people by location. The platform recommends people in areas near you. You can actually find people very easily through searching on the platform, as opposed to some of these encrypted messaging services where you actually have to already kind of know the community to get pulled into something. And then there's the aspect of access. Facebook runs these free internet programs, sometimes called Express Wi-Fi, sometimes called Facebook Connectivity, all around the world, including in places like the Middle East and North Africa. They've run these programs in areas like Morocco and Iraq. And ultimately, for users who can't afford an internet connection, they partner with mobile providers for free data access to Facebook platforms specifically. So when you hear the phrase, in some countries, Facebook is the internet, that's because thanks to these free data platforms that also may violate net neutrality issues, Facebook is the only platform some users that have mobile only data can access because it's the only one they can afford to get onto. We've seen this as a widespread issue for things like migrant smuggling in Latin America. And we're also seeing this issue in parts of the Middle East and North Africa. So you don't just have the reach, the lower bar to entry, but also just the general accessibility that makes Facebook unique in how it spreads this kind of content. Well, this is a lot of stuff. Isn't it too big for these platforms to handle? No, it's not. Because we're talking about companies that have these are some of the wealthiest tech companies on the planet. They can certainly afford to hire experts to address not just things like antiquities trafficking, but wildlife trafficking and drug trafficking. If we as volunteers can find this volume of material using subject matter expertise, then certainly Facebook can invest in an army of those experts to ensure that their platform is safe, effective, and legal. So why don't the platforms just remove this content if it's that easy? Profit. And that's the part we're going to get into next. Understanding these issues is more than just understanding the anthropology of looting or the archaeological aspect of the material. It's understanding why this stuff is allowed on these platforms in the first place. We know that it's illegal in many of the countries that I just showed you. So why are they allowed to engage in this? For starters, there's the issue that US regulations simply just aren't there. There's nothing that forces the platforms to address this kind of illegal activity. But there's another issue. By not investing in enforcing these policies, the platforms are actually able to profit more. And I'll show you how. So Facebook put in their policy about what they called historical artifacts. They actually banned, as a policy, any content that attempts to buy, sell, trade, donate, gift, or even ask for historical artifacts. That means not just the illicit stuff that we showed you, but based on Facebook's own written policy, the sale of artifacts isn't allowed at all. Or is it? So as I mentioned, we've tested this theory. We've reported the content, very explicit content. Here it says it's ancient, price, and Facebook didn't remove. So it's a clear indicator that they are not adhering to their own policies, even when content is reported to them. And when we use our sock puppet account that we use for Facebook Antiquities Trafficking, and we go through to the ad preferences, everybody can access this on your Facebook account. If you're offered an ad and you click on the 3 dots up in the upper right-hand corner, say, why am I seeing this ad? You can click through a number of things that will eventually take you to your interest categories. That's what Facebook has tagged as it thinking you are interested in order to serve you advertising content. And here we see very clearly treasure hunting is one of the interest categories that Facebook uses to serve ads, despite it being a violation of the platform's own policies. And Facebook profits from running these types of ads. Here we see our account was served ads for a mini museum, which is offering Roman arrowheads for sale, pieces of Egyptian papyri. And this is being offered right alongside looting content that is showing up in our newsfeed. Facebook also has a patent to use image recognition to scan your personal photos for brands. Now, if you're on Instagram and you post a lot of cat videos or cat photos, like I do, for instance, I'll post photos mainly of my cat who's orange and white. I don't go looking online for orange and white cats, but Facebook not only feeds me videos specifically of orange and white cats, on Instagram, it actually recommends searching for ginger cat. That's just one example of how this kind of technology can be used to scan what you're interested in. And we see it being applied on Facebook. Here you see a post right above Roman coins for sale that's offering jewelry made out of Roman coins for quite a hefty price. You see that it's a sponsored post. When we go to their site, we see that they have lots of Facebook ads, and they actually also run a Facebook shop. So Facebook isn't just profiting from the ads in this case that are violating their own policy, but they're also profiting from the Facebook shop that's violating their policy, because Facebook takes a cut of every sale made in a Facebook shop in the US. So if you purchase that coin necklace for $3,800, Facebook gets a cut of that in addition to getting the advertising revenue. So they're profiting on multiple fronts from failing to enforce their own policies. Here's an example of a piece. It says that it's an ancient coin. It makes very clear that this is not a fake, and that this is something that Facebook is going to profit off of. We also see Facebook in not enforcing their policies on Marketplace, like this item here. They actually list ads on Marketplace. So although if you list something on Marketplace, Facebook may not be getting a cut of your sale, if you put it on Marketplace at all, Facebook is still profiting from adding advertisements to those listings, and that includes on illicit content like artifacts. But it is not just Facebook. Google is also a massive tech company that does not escape scrutiny in this area. And all of this content I'm going to show you is part of an upcoming paper we have. Google Play offers a huge range of applications that you can purchase to teach you how to loot or even traffic antiquities. Here you have one that you can see. It's been installed over 1,000 times. You have to purchase these apps. And in addition to that, as you see here, it says the app contains ads, which means that Google is still profiting from ads that are in that app. This one is hosted by what is called the Treasure Channel. This is based in the MENA region where this kind of content is illicit. Again, here's another example of an app. This one has more than 10,000 installs. This is another looting and trafficking app. It even has, as you can see, one of the little graphics showing you the what they think is the anatomy of a tomb to make it easier to loot. And then there's the trafficking apps. And this one here, which we use auto-translate for just to make it easier to post. But this is one that says that it's going to help you sell treasures, help you sell artifacts. And specifically, they'll even allegedly show them to Christie's, and they'll contact you if your pieces are important and will be sold in auction. But don't publish this application with people who are not trustworthy. That means they know this is an illicit application, and this one in particular is probably a scam. But regardless, they're engaging in this activity and Google is profiting from it. But Google-owned YouTube also profits from this activity, and they enable it for the traffickers to profit. When YouTube allows monetization tools like ads, like what you see here, that means not just YouTube is getting the ad money, but the person who runs this channel is also profiting. This particular channel that is being shared out of Turkey, we blurred the imagery, but it's essentially a grave that was being looted. You can tell it's a person who was buried. And this content is being monetized in multiple ways. You see it includes paid promotion. As a result, that means this person who's hosting this content doesn't actually have to sell an item at all. They're profiting sheerly from the video looting of this grave and continuing to monetize that. Both the content creator and Google are profiting from this kind of content. And it's not just happening in the Middle East. We recently posted about this user just the other day who posted a link to his YouTube video in Ukraine. Again, the metal detecting looting in Ukraine is illegal. And here we have a user who has posted another monetized ad, a monetized video. This video shows active looting, and it even contains display ads, so it's constantly being monetized. And we'll also see cross-platforming, where users will take a platform that maybe they can't easily monetize, but they can get a big following and drive stuff to their YouTube monetized platform. So for example, this TikTok user had 9 million followers on TikTok. And while he couldn't monetize it on that platform, all he has to do is post clips of what he has on YouTube, generate interest, and then drive users to his YouTube platform where the content is heavily monetized, allowing both the looter and YouTube to profit without this looter ever making a sale. So this is a massive problem. And how can we address this issue as archaeologists, as anthropologists, to deal with these massive corporations and stop both companies and criminals from profiting from this kind of pillage? That's where you have to step outside of the archaeology bubble. And it's really important to understand the policy issues behind this. And this is a lot of what I've been doing in my day job, is trying to understand these kind of policies. But targeting the legal loopholes that allow these tech companies to engage in this activity with no repercussions is critically important. There are a lot of bills before Congress right now, and anybody that has seen what's happening in Congress would recognize that tech is the one area where there is significant bipartisan support, tech regulation. And that's something that as you know, archaeologists and anthropologists, we can seize on. And that means becoming an activist in your community, sharing your expertise with lawmakers, calling your senators, ensuring that they understand the necessity of dealing with these crimes because of the global repercussions. And as usual, I don't want to leave with a totally hopeless note. And I'd like to highlight this example from the great work that people are doing in Libya on antiquities trafficking. We posted in August 2020 these artifacts from Libya that were offered for sale. They had been looted from the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Cyrene. You can tell because of the veiled goddesses that are specific to that particular site. And just a few months after we shared this and it was posted, Libyan authorities were able to seize those artifacts before they left the country. And in a kind of twist of irony, they posted their seizure with a thumbs up on their Facebook page. So the artifacts that had been offered for sale on Facebook, when they were returned to authorities, they were put up on there as a symbol of the ability to preserve those items. This is just a drop in the bucket compared to what's happening globally, but more awareness of this and more visibility on this issue can not only pressure companies, but also help global authorities understand how to find this kind of content online. And we frequently post updates on our Twitter page. So if you are interested in following more about what's being trafficked on Facebook, you can follow us at ATHAR Project on Twitter. We do not have a Facebook page or an Instagram. Twitter is where you'll find us. And if you guys have any questions, just let me know.
Thank you so much for an excellent, fascinating, and bit saddening lecture, but very informative of what's going on. I will open up the chat now, or I should say open up for questions now, either in the chat or if you would like to just raise your hand and unmute yourself, you're welcome to that as well. If not, we can read out any questions that come up in the chat.
I have a question. Hi, do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Hi, thank you for this wonderful talk and for talking to us about this really important work you're doing. With the last slide, especially, we kind of went to the question that I have, where you talked mostly about reporting to Facebook and US legal system, but I was wondering how much you also maybe report to the local authorities in the Middle East and North Africa about individuals you identify, or maybe even locations.
So we do share certain content with authorities in places like Egypt and places where we have contacts with authorities. One thing we do not do for ethical purposes is share people's identities. Even if somebody is appearing truthful in all of the information they're sharing online, we can't prove if they're using, you know, a neighbor they don't like's profile photo. So we will share that the artifacts are available, any information we have about where they might be, but we don't share people's private information because in many cases we are dealing with vulnerable populations. And when you know in a place like Egypt that you can get 10 years to life in prison for something like antiquities trafficking, that's not appropriate for an individual who may be engaging in this activity to feed their family. So there is an ethical reason we do not share identities, but we will share information regarding artifacts that have not left the country or are still available when we have contacts. That said, in some cases, as you saw, the material is quite large, involves serious and well-connected networks. And when we are concerned for the safety of people We may not share with the local authorities, but we may wait till that information or that material is in a Western country or somewhere where Interpol has better access. So there are a lot of factors, and it really is on a country by country basis. But in countries like Syria, where there's obviously no way to engage authorities there, that's where it's so important that we continue to document and preserve this evidence for when the material eventually does make its way onto the market, so that we can prove that it was looted from the country.
A question from Belinda Barrington in the chat. Who do you notify if you spot looted antiquities being sold online? Interpol?
Again, I think that depends on the location of the sale, the seller, whether it's, if you can prove the item was looted. A lot of what the content that we look at is specifically from countries where there is not a legal sale for antiquities. So it means that any of this material is being looted. But if you're talking about material maybe being offered on eBay, it's a lot harder to see. You're not going to see items offered in situ, for instance. And so it's a lot more difficult to prove the looting. So a lot of this is circumstantial depending on the location, the platform. In many cases, platforms like eBay do have policies against these issues. So if you see something being sold online, I would first check the policy of the platform you're looking at, try to report it so it gets taken down. Of course, screenshot it first to preserve it. But then, if you can figure out where that is located, contacting the authorities in that region. But again, a lot of it just depends on the circumstances of the context of what you're looking at.
You mentioned how difficult it is to track the sale from the buyer end, right? That you lose information there. Do you have trends in data about buyers at all, location of people or demographics?
So we do have on our website an interactive map, links to our interactive map from our initial report, where we were able to track when people would express interest in purchasing an artifact. So obviously because we're not engaging, we're not making it to we're not, pretending to be interested or making it to those final private messages, but we would record the locations of those who expressed interest and asked for then a direct message. And we found that many of them were local. A lot of the trafficking that we see is the middleman's middleman. So we're seeing items literally going straight from the ground, maybe to a trafficker who can get them to the country's border, or if they're already near the border, somebody who can get it over the border. So we're not seeing a lot of end market interaction here. And because of that, materials moving a lot more locally. But we do see, particularly in Asia, a lot of examples of much more transnational trafficking. So Afghan artifacts being offered for sale by traffickers in Thailand, and them explicitly saying the material came from Afghanistan. So I think that those are, there's a kind of variety in the trafficking, but we're only able to really capture what is in the open source, since we don't want to engage in participant observation. I see Tiffany's question. Tiffany, that is a fantastic question. And I think that there are a lot of opportunities here, particularly because ASOR and heritage issues are not a partisan issue in many cases. That with the vast bipartisan support on the tech platforms, we're able to get more attention. I think that looking at the senators that have and the members of Congress that have really spoken out most about the need for tech regulation, and then kind of targeting them based on what committees they're on. So for instance, if you see someone who's on the Foreign Affairs Committee that has also spoken out about tech regulation, highlighting the fact that there are war crimes that are being facilitated by these platforms, and using your expertise as a heritage expert and somebody who may work in conflict zones or have colleagues in conflict zones that can speak to this issue. Similarly, there are issues with regard to extremism. Anyone who is on committees engaging in that, or intelligence committees, this is another national security risk that an American company is facilitating. And they're facilitating the financing of these groups, and again, being able to highlight that. So there's sort of a strategy to identifying the people who are friendly to this issue in Congress, and then working with them and highlighting to them that there are major risks. And ultimately, when you want to, if you want to point out, taxpayer issues, I think it's also worth noting that in many of these conflict zones, the US and a lot of US organizations provide significant funding to trying to stop these crimes, to preserving heritage. And we have these American companies that are actually accelerating trafficking and heritage destruction at a rate that we hadn't previously seen. So you're really doing the taxpayers a favor if you can stop that by stopping the flow of this material at the rate it's coming out online. Yeah, I'm looking at this question from Gary. It's a bit long. We have 230 was one of the issues we actually addressed in our report. And I think what you're referencing is the Communications Decency Act, not the Computer Decency Act. But we have found there have been instances where Facebook may be liable. So for those who don't know, the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, was written in 1996. And it was essentially meant to help protect small tech companies that were up and coming startups like Amazon from being criminally liable for content that was posted by third parties. So if somebody posted child sex abuse material on your platform, the platform wouldn't get in trouble. The person who posted that would, because presumably the platform did not intend to do that. And this essentially makes them immune. They call it the sword and the shield. The shield is the immunity that these companies get from content posted by third parties. And the sword is that they get to kind of wield their own way to ensure that the content is protected, because otherwise they would go bankrupt trying to address this. That was in 1996. The internet has come a very long way since then. And these now major corporations that lead much of our global economy have really used this law far beyond its intention to shield themselves from any wrongdoing in courting their algorithmic amplification of content. They're profiting from this kind of content. And so I think that there are lots of opportunities to poke holes in that. We've seen it done with sex abuse crimes and sex trafficking. That immunity has been lost, and there are now civil lawsuits happening for Facebook. And until there are additional holes in that kind of immunity shield, it's difficult to prosecute on this front. However, we are seeing cases like the new case of the Rohingya that are suing Facebook for knowingly facilitating the genocide, being warned about it many times. So with internal communications and whistleblowers, we can put together a better case. But what ATHAR project has been involved in, and this is where you really have to dive into policy world as an anthropologist, is looking at more creative ways to address this problem. And in our case, we've worked with ACCO to file a whistleblower complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and illustrating that Facebook has lied to its investors about its ability and willingness to address criminal activity on its platform. Steve, good question. So not all of those examples were men, actually. We do blur the iconography. There are quite a few women engaged in trafficking, and in Thailand, it's mainly women that actually run the trafficking groups. Myself and Sam Hardy have been kind of tracking the engagement of women in trafficking for quite some time, but there's certainly an element of female engagement here, and we see it in places like Egypt. Women are also arrested for leading trafficking gangs, and so there are certainly, don't take the assumption at face value that it's men engaged in that, although in some of the videos and photos I showed, it was men. But we do try to track patterns like gender, whether or not they are a migrant. We see a lot of Syrians who have migrated to Europe that then use their connections back home as a means of trafficking and sustaining themselves in foreign countries. So we try to keep track of those trends without, while maintaining the anonymity of the users.
Thank you so much for this presentation and for fielding all of our questions. I think we all really enjoyed it. I'll close out our session today since we're about to hit the hour mark. So thank you for everyone for joining us. This is our last virtual event for the Early Career Scholars of ASOR. So thank you for joining us for that. And we will see you again when the academic year starts around September or October when we start events again. And I hope everyone has a wonderful summer. Thank you so much, Katie.
Thanks so much.